was, what are the aesthetic implications of the cable stay type itself? And so that's summarized on the next slide. Staff did a tremendous amount of work on those two questions, and then in the following slide presented a response to the cable stayed aesthetic questions. So if you're looking at the slide with the concerns we heard, what we did is summarize some of the concerns that were voiced about the cable stayed types that were related to some of its fundamental requirements, towers and cables supporting the deck. One was a concern that I've titled context. How will this bridge, which has been done before, not much on the West Coast, but has been done before, how will it be made to respond to the unique Portland context? What will make this a Portland-specific bridge type? The second was, how do we envision this bridge with its tall towers in this defined space? And if you flip back to the title slide, that space is defined by the Markham Bridge on the north, the Ross Island Bridge on the south, the MLK Viaduct on the east, and then the berm and I-5 on the west, which is a perceivable human-scaled space. We're putting a large object. And finally, related to the notion of scale, and specifically the height and scale mass of the towers, how can we ensure that that bridge type can deliver a high-quality, satisfying pedestrian experience for people moving under it, being near it, but also moving across it? And those were concerns that the committee had voiced, and others had voiced as we've gone out and talked informally in conversation with the committee. And it wasn't a unilateral concern, but those were the concerns the committee, these were the words we used to summarize the concerns we heard. So our response after work, if you looked at the design principles, was to introduce 3 principles that would act as commitments that were in addition to our other principles that we would add to this bridge type, and 3 commitments that we would deliver on as we move into the next phase of work, which is moving from the bridge type selection to the actual design of the bridge itself. And one principle was to commit to custom bridge, that we would find those Portland contexts that are important, tangible and intangible, and find a way to respond so that this bridge could only exist in Portland. It was truly part of the Portland community. Second was to use the design effort in the next phase to ensure that all scales, viewing the bridge from the distance, being near it, and being up close, even to those top towers that would be tall objects, worked, and in particular worked at the pedestrian scale, so that there was a comfort and ability and that all those design elements were a unified and integrated design. And you can see the image on the right, which is a living, breathing version of cable stay that I used to talk about, the range of what's possible with this bridge type. But then finally, to capitalize on the transparency that's inherent in a cable stay bridge, there's that openness that you can see in the image between the stay cables and the center, to really build on that, but also to come back and find a way to address and to find a way to relate these towers to a human scale. And intimacy might be overstating it, but to really work in the design to make sure that when a pedestrian, a bicyclist, and a transit user passed those towers, they didn't feel overwhelmed or overpowered, but that those experiences were part of a sequence or episode of experiences moving across the bridge that was very satisfying. If you look at the next slide, we also showed some of what we thought was possible, the range of responses that were possible to address that. So this slide is a placeholder for context, and we talked about the ability to look at the tower configuration, look at the finishes, look at the overall, and from the overall images through all the scales of design to make sure that we brought all, with our public conversation, the context to bear and had embodied it in the design and created a custom bridge. The next slide was meant to speak to, again, the detail, the total design, the range that's available in this type, to work again at all scales from the largest elements in the forest east down to the finishes, aesthetic lighting, railings, and bring all that together with a unified design concept. And then finally, the pedestrian experience and the range of responses, showing a view of potentially some additional space it overlooks, and also talking about how do we make those towers work as in a tactile way to people who may be very near them, and how do we build on this notion of a series of experiences as one moves across, moving from the bridge abutment to the tower to the midspan, and then off of the bridge. And for information, since scale is about relative mass, and it gets tossed around a lot, but it does have something to do with the height of the element. This slide gives folks a sense of how tall were the alternatives, the cable stayed alternatives, relative to the existing tram at its elevation, and then potential future buildings in this area. Because scale is about relative size, it was important to engage all of our minds in not only what exists now, but what may exist in this district in the future. If we look at the slide, we then talked about how our next steps in preliminary engineering, which we hope to have approval to begin on very soon, would relook at pier and span arrangement, which would affect all three of these principles. We would finalize the section, the width of the bridge, which is another conversation. We would look at the tower configuration. We introduced a new notion of an H-tower, which has some benefits, but everything has a trade-off in an element of this magnitude. We would work through connection detailing and then furnishings and finishes. So the textures, the railing details, and those are meant to be in kind of a descending order. But the key here is that they're not working independently, that they're all informing each other to get to this unified design. And we say then implement design guidelines, but I think the idea was that the public conversation and continued input from the RBAC and others would actually form the design guidelines as we discovered the proper way to embody these principles in the cable stayed bridge type. The other open question was about cost. We did a lot of work on cost, and in summary what we found was that a lot of the cost differences between these two bridges had to do with the quantity of steel and the type of steel that was inherent in the waveframe and not inherent in the cable stayed type. And that affected schedule and the cost of the material itself. If you look at the slide, this is what we learned. You're seeing some of the highlights, and that percentage, 60% of the total cost is in steel in the wave, only 25 in cable stayed. And when you work that steel and that specialty steel through, it affects every stage of the design and the cost estimation, contingency, bidding, and then the notion of volatility. And then the slide with cost estimate, and there's a tremendous amount of detailed work behind this. But the summary point is that there is a very, very significant cost delta between the highest price cable stayed and the waveframe inserter. And Neil articulated our concerns, our grave concerns about offering that as a choice and whether it was a real choice, given what we know about delivering a project under the Federal Transit Administration's rules. And with that information, we feel that the committee will recommend, the RBAC committee will recommend to the steering committee that we move forward with a cable stayed bridge type only into our next stage of design and public conversation.
Just before leaving this, maybe two quick questions or two quick comments. One is on the cost side, that with the yellow highlights and so on. Understand that that box at the bottom is what we call a year of expenditure. The yellow box is really just if it were in January of '09 dollars. Obviously, you're not going to build it in January of '09. Therefore, it's the red line is not as if that's a padded number. That's just taking inflationary costs and rolling them up. Second, you've heard a fair amount environmentally about you want fewer piers and so on. Understand that the 4-pier, from an environmental standpoint, probably is more attractive because 2 of the piers are actually on the shoreline. They're on land. And that means then that the other 2 piers that are in the water actually get to be in deeper water, not as in shallow water. And from a fish standpoint, you worry more about the obstructions in the shallow water area. So it's almost counterintuitive to think that 4 piers are better from an environmental standpoint, in truth, because 2 of those piers are on land, and therefore the other 2 piers can be in deeper water. It really is generally speaking, the fish agencies would like that better.
That was going to be my question.
Oh.
I didn't quite understand the difference between the 4 and the 2. So on 4 you have 2 more, or 1 on each end. Is that it?
Yeah, and then push the middle ones in a little bit.
Okay, gotcha.
Preliminary engineering will detail that a lot more, and we'll actually lock that down with great precision. But still, the general relationship.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I love that wave bridge, but look at the cost yet. I mean, I like the looks of it, but look at the cost. I didn't